President Vladimir Putin. The White House is working on the logistics of the meeting with their Russian counterparts. Levitt says Trump hopes to have a trilateral meeting that includes Ukraine soon. And the president may also visit Russia one day.
President Trump is determined to try and end this war and stop the killing. As the president has said over and over again, his strong preference will always be for peace and partnership whenever those outcomes can possibly be achieved. There is no leader in the world right now who has been more committed to preventing wars or ending them than President Donald Trump.
The White House says the goal of the meeting is for Trump to walk away with a better understanding of how to end the war. And joining us now to discuss U.S. peace efforts regarding the Russia-Ukraine war is Mike Leon, Director of Strategy at the Free and Equal Elections Foundation and host of the Can We Please Talk podcast. And also joining us is retired Lieutenant Colonel Darren Gobb, Black Hawk helicopter pilot and former battalion commander in the U.S. Army, and author of the book Veritas Vincit. So good afternoon to you both. Colonel Gobb, I'll start with you today. So as you're already aware, Trump is going to meet Putin in just a few days. What's your read on Russia's sudden advance in Ukraine before the meeting? Does President Putin stand to gain anything by that, by doing this ahead of negotiations?
Yeah, hey, good afternoon. I think there is a very good chance that Putin does see himself having the strategic advantage in eastern Ukraine and Crimea specifically, as well as the strategic decisions surrounding who owns the Crimea ultimately, as well as partnership in NATO for Ukraine, which is something that are red lines for him that he's said, Ukraine cannot be in NATO. But he's also said that at this point, with what he's invested, that he will not stop until they achieved all their objectives. And for him to be able to stay, he's willing to meet with Trump in Alaska at this point means largely that he's probably achieved most of those strategic objectives, or he's extremely close, which from my reading, what's going on in eastern Ukraine looks like he probably has, because they have the upper hand right now. And the only thing stopping them from moving forward, frankly, right now is themselves.
Okay, Mike, what do you think? What are you looking at ahead of this meeting?
Well, first off, good to see everybody on this afternoon. This has been something, I think, Don, that has kind of gone a little bit on the back burner, obviously, with Israel's new plan for Gaza City and with respect to geopolitics and the different wars that President Trump has been trying to put out and people coming in the Oval Office. I think we've lost sight of this Russia-Ukraine war. 6,300 drones Russia launched into Ukraine in July of just this year, a 16% increase from June. So there has been offensives that Russia has continued to carry out on Ukraine. There's been mixed messages from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Obviously, we all saw about what happened in the Oval Office between Zelensky and everybody, but we're months away from that. But then the president also said, if you recall, in a conference that he had, I want to say about 3 weeks ago, he said, I spoke to Vladimir, great call. And then Melania tells me that another city is blown up, right? So he understands the gravity of this situation. He understands how Russia is advancing. I'm very, I don't want to use the word excited, but I am excited to hear how these talks come together. I'm excited that I heard today in that press briefing that it's a trilateral call. Maybe they'll have Zelensky conference in. They're still trying to work on those details because you have to include Zelensky in these negotiations. Everybody on the GOP side, if you recall, Don, back in the day in 2023 going into 2024, said that in order to end this war, there has to be some land concessions. Well, if there has to be land concessions in the Ukraine's constitution, you can't do that right now, right? So Zelensky has to be included in these talks. We have to figure out a way to peace, a sustainable way to peace. But again, Putin broke peace when he negotiated that deal that with Angela Merkel and Macron and Zelensky back in, I believe it was 2019. So I don't know how this ends, but I'm actually interested to see that Putin and Trump are actually meeting on American soil in Alaska, something the previous administration didn't do. And I do want to see an end to this war finally.
So building on what Mike is saying, Colonel Gobb, how is Trump supposed to thread the needle here? What leverage does Washington hold over Kyiv and Moscow?
Yeah, that's one of the greatest challenges right now, is that because Washington doesn't have a lot of leverage over Moscow or Kyiv, but mostly over Moscow they don't, because they being Moscow have built a plan around this war having to happen at some point. And it did. What they did was create a different circle of alliances. They built gold reserves. They built an economy that was they planned on having largely being immune from American sanctions and Western sanctions in general, and the ability to sell energy through proxies. So that leverage, though there to a point, has not been effective. And the threat of sanctions against secondary power or secondary nations like India could have some influence on what happens. But like Mike said, this is hard to do, and this is simply ending the war in 24 hours, as Trump said at one point, was always going to be unrealistic. But you've got to keep trying. And this is a good sign that they're going to meet in person, because it means that the conditions that have been working through the junior staff members across the State Department and multiple other agencies have been met well enough that both sides think it's worth doing.
So, Mike, if no deal is reached, perhaps you think a deal could be reached, but what happens if a deal is not reached? What can we expect from Putin, from Trump, from Zelensky?
Well, I don't think we'll see a deal, obviously, on Friday. I mean, if it does, I mean, President Trump will be carrying that for the next 6 months. You won't hear anything about any other topic about ending this war that has gone on for 3 years and that his predecessor couldn't end. But back to Darren's point, and I agree with it a lot, is that diplomacy is the best way to try to resolve this. When I've spoken to former Obama State Department officials that were working during the 2014 annexation of Crimea, right? And my biggest contention with them has always been the pushback is like, how do you negotiate with Russia? How do you negotiate with, for all intent and purpose, a dictator, a former KGB officer who wants to reunify the Soviet Union? That's always been his plan, right? He hasn't made any bones about that. How do you negotiate with that? And I think the first thing that the Trump administration did when they came in, and I've stated this on this network as well, is this policy change that Rich Grinnell even mentioned, is that we're actually going to go talk to Russia. And that's why you saw Marco Rubio meet in Saudi Arabia with Sergei Lavrov and the Russian delegation there. So I don't expect any deal, but what I do expect is that finally the two leaders of this conflict, and hopefully the third one, specifically the third one that got invaded, will all be a part of this call to actually talk about the particulars of all of this, because at the end of the day, this really involves the land that has already been that is currently under Russian control right now, and whether or not that will stay and remain, because that's the only way we're actually going to get a solution for this. Because like I mentioned before, when we did have a pseudo ceasefire that was put in place by some of these other countries with Russia and Ukraine, Vladimir Putin broke that because he felt like he was being infringed upon with respect to NATO. So how we have everlasting peace over there, it's a very complex answer. I don't have the answers. I don't know if Darren has the answers. He's got the military solutions potentially, but it's such an involved process. The only good that I see so far, Don, is that President Trump is getting on a plane and he's meeting with the other person involved in this face to face, like Darren said. This is not through the secondary delegates that are going out there. This is leader to leader. Let's figure out how we end this. And I think that could finally give us a timetable as to where this war could potentially end.
Okay, Colonel, maybe you can comment on what Mike said. How do we have long-term peace?
Yeah, I will tell you that I've lived all over Eastern Europe. I've served in many of these countries in varying capacities, not only military, but worked with them diplomatically as well. There is a lot of bad blood going back hundreds of years between Russia, Ukraine, and other nations in the Middle East. Extraordinarily complicated to put all the pieces together, to understand the history, and for people to be able to maybe put on the shelf some of these animosities for the sake of a lasting peace. Is it possible? Anything is always possible, and it's always worth trying. But to get there is not going to be easy. I agree with Mike. You're not going to see a deal this Friday. Perfectly happy to be surprised, but I think this is just the first of more than one meeting that's going to happen to get that in place. Lasting peace, I would hope to see economic ties that can lift everybody up and avoid the military ties that put everybody in a place of suspecting everybody else, and then we end up back here again.
Okay, Mike, so you said earlier that perhaps Zelensky could be brought into the negotiations on Friday. So originally, I think he wasn't supposed to attend. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Does the current negotiation framework treat Russia and Ukraine equally? Does it appear to favor one side more?
Yeah, Don, I mean, like this is the overarching question. This is what I was talking about with respect to some of the mixed messages out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It was really like we all saw what happened, you know, back in whatever month that was. I think it was in March with Zelensky visiting here in Washington, D.C. But now in the subsequent months, we've also seen Donald Trump come out with some pretty harsh statements about Vladimir Putin and feeling that he's been betrayed or tricked, or I don't want to mince his words, with respect to Vladimir Putin. So that kind of mixed messaging has caused, I mean, it would naturally cause unease with folks that live in Ukraine, because we were, under the previous administration, helping with Ukraine's weapon supply, right? And so I think my hope is that he's not treating both as equal. I think that's the part of this that, to Darren's point, with respect to the bad blood and the tensions, like all things are not equal with respect to this region. If we just take the 30,000 foot overview that Ukraine was a sovereign country and back in February of 2022, they were invaded. If we don't have that approach, if the president doesn't have that approach, because as he has said in that meeting with Zelensky, he has said, you know, well, both actors here and things like that. He's tried to dance that line. When you meet with the leader of Russia in person, my hope is that the talk is a little bit tougher, but tougher in respect that it gets to somewhere with respect to peace. And I don't think we achieve any of that if we don't have some of the disputes already of the land that's already been acquired by Russia that's currently under Russian control. I just don't know how you get past some of that, especially after a war that's killed over, reports are saying anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million with respect to soldiers and obviously civilians that have been killed. So I just don't know how we do all of that, but I would like the president to not weight both of these things equally. I don't weight Vladimir Putin and what he has done to Russia as equal as Zelensky and Ukraine. But again, I think Donald Trump, the biggest thing that I can give credit for, and a lot of people won't give him credit for this, I'll give him credit for it. He's going on a plane to Alaska to meet with the leader of Russia and talk to him face to face. That is one of the most important steps to potentially having peace and potentially having some type of, even if it's short term, a framework of the next 6 months of we have a ceasefire type deal in place, even if it's something that's a temporary Band-Aid, at least we would have that closure because he got on that plane and went to meet Vladimir Putin face to face.
All right, we just have time for one more comment. Darren, if you have any final thoughts.
Yeah, I think the last thing that I guess to make that Band-Aid stick and move forward a lot longer would be to get the European nations that are part of NATO with us to be part of that message that peace through strength, again, it counts, it does work. And there's been some mixed messaging out of nations' capitals throughout Europe as well. Not saying that we're ever going to get that perfect, but it would be nice if we could end this thing knowing that we come out of it NATO unified and not NATO divided.
Well, all right, Colonel Gobb, Mike, thank you very much for coming on today.